wanted to do today is, I think, a little bit different and hopefully a lot of fun. First thing is, there are no PowerPoint slides.
Thank you.
Good. If you want a PowerPoint slide, you have to go to another session. What we wanted to do was sort of have a conversation. And it's around what sort of the session is billed as. You know, the thing that we're all seeking, I think, is impact at scale. And there are a lot of different communities and efforts out to do that. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that there's a real opportunity to maybe interact more, to cross boundaries more, and from an enterprise perspective, to figure out how do we build more robust partnerships or partnership ecosystems to make things happen. And from a sort of an intermediary or a funder to think more about how do we also facilitate partnerships. So that's really the theme of the session today, is to think a lot about not sort of the success or activity of a specific organization or individual, but more what they've learned about going to scale, and particularly the role that partners can play or should play. So it's a lot about lessons learned, and we've got a great panel. And what we're going to do is I'm going to let them each self-introduce. So the deal is they have about 5 minutes to introduce themselves, and then to tell you a little bit about what they do, and then I've encouraged them to say at least one very provocative thing, if they can, about the topic to get us started. Sasha, we did talk about this. So.
You said one or two in our practice.
Okay.
Yeah. And then what we're going to do is sort of have a conversation. So we're going to have a discussion, and then what we want to do is bring you guys into that. So we'll have a chance for some questions and things like that. And we'd love to bring you in, but when we do it, we want to bring it in the spirit of a conversation, not in the spirit of some people, hopefully no one in this room, often doesn't really have a question, they have a statement. And we'd prefer not to do that. There's other places for that, but if you want to join the conversation as we go along, you know, we'll sort of be, so if you've got questions or some sort of provocative thing you want to say as well, that's great. And we'll kind of figure out a way to build all that in the next hour. Does that seem like a reasonable game plan? Yeah. Okay, I think it'll be fun. So we've got Megan, Sasha, and Giselle. I don't know how you guys, we didn't discuss the order, but how would you guys like to go?
Well, the mic was passed on to me.
Okay.
So by default, I'm going to start. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. We were talking a few minutes ago about using these introductions to give a sense of our experiences. So I'll talk a little bit about my own experience working in the inclusive business sector, which is where I've been for the last 6 years, in emerging markets and focused on the agriculture sector. And hopefully those examples will add some good fodder to our discussion together the next hour. So when I started working in this space, it was in the Philippines. I was working with small-scale subsistence rice producers who, in a nutshell, went from being subsistence farmers to business people who export their heirloom, indigenous, organic, fair trade rice to high-end retailers in Europe and the US. And my involvement was the connection with high-end retailers. And there were a lot of ancillary services around that, quality control, investment in infrastructure, etc. So if it's of interest, we can talk about it later in the session. Another example is the years I spent in India, which is where I designed with the team and scaled an inclusive business focused on dairy. So there are over 3,000 small-scale dairy farmers who are shareholders in that business. And again, a common theme here is the ancillary services around it, whether it's a different kind of financing product that worked for these particular farmers and what they needed to purchase dairy cows, veterinary services, etc. And a more recent example at the place where I currently work is which is Land O'Lakes. If you have spent some time in the US, you'll have seen the butter in the supermarkets. I grew up thinking that Land O'Lakes were the butter people, and then learned a few years ago that they also do other things. They're a Fortune 200 company. They're also a cooperative. They're the second biggest cooperative in the US, which is what attracted me to work with them, given my experiences abroad. And they have an international development business unit, which is the unit I work with. So I started out working with Land O'Lakes based in Tanzania, then in Zimbabwe, and now I support a range of projects from Washington, D.C. And this year, one of my main responsibilities has been working with multinational companies focused on livestock genetics based in Europe, US, and Africa, getting them to enter the market in Tanzania and Ethiopia for the first time, and getting them to prioritize smallholder farmers as a customer group. So that's a whole bunch of examples, and I'll make some comments a little bit later about how I think one of the problems in inclusive businesses is that it's a bunch of examples and not exactly evidence about models, but that's for a little bit later. What I'll say is something that I hope will be provocative and thought-provoking, is that in all these examples I've been involved in the many more examples and anecdotes that I've seen across the inclusive business space, one thing I've learned is you need time to build relationships. And in my space, where in the international development industry, a lot of times you're in an intermediary role and you might be working with a donor, whether it's governmental, Gates, etc., that wants things to work at a certain pace. And it wants that pace so a certain amount of money can be pushed out of the door in a certain amount of time frame, where it's exciting because partnerships are looking like they're going very well in the initial phase and you want to accelerate that process. But I always compare it to a marriage or to trust. You can only accelerate building trust so much. And I've learned that if you don't invest in mutual due diligence and the feasibility of a partnership, it's not really a partnership, it's a transaction. And you're not agreeing on not just what you want to measure, but how you want to measure it. You're not agreeing on shared metrics and the value. And the danger that comes from that I've seen is that what could start as an inclusive business doesn't stay inclusive. What starts off as an impact investment 5 years down the line is no longer so impactful. And so when I think about redefining what our relationship building looks like, thinking about that upfront investment in time and getting all the parties to know each other, that's been a key characteristic in success or failure for me in this space.
Hi, I'm Sasha Dichter. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Acumen. I've been doing that, or I've been at Acumen for about 9 years. And relevant to this panel, before that I spent 5 years doing CSR work at GE Capital and IBM before that. I'll just talk about what we're doing in kind of Acumen and corporate partnerships and not other stuff. We have been working in various ways with companies for a while, but I feel like there's been a pretty significant shift in the last 12 to 18 months from kind of an early, obviously funder relationships are one thing, but an early relationship with Dow where we ended up co-investing in one of our companies, Water Health International, and kind of on a very individual Acumen to Dow and Acumen to some of Dow staff level, I think have had a very productive kind of journey through that, and we can talk a little bit about what that learning has looked like. To more corporations as funders and not necessarily really seeing that progress to the partnership, to really now in the last couple of years in particular seeing really more substantive, interesting partnerships with a longer list. Goldman Sachs, Mitsubishi, Dow, on and on. But the biggest one is a partnership that we have with Unilever called the ELI, the Enhancing Livelihoods Initiative, which is focused on working with social enterprises to increase value in their supply chain and to help those social enterprises be more successful and scale. So the member of our team, Yasmina Zaidman, who is really the point person on that, is really the expert on everything that's taken, but I feel like I'll do my best to represent. And I guess what I would there's two things. So I would definitely second the notion on trust, and we can talk a little bit more about kind of relationships and what it takes to get there. My attempt at a provocative statement would be maybe less on the point of partnership and more just broadly, which is there does seem to me to be a subset of the corporate world which has been, so I have been looking at CSR and corporate stuff for 15 years or so, and so it is a little bit surreal because a lot of the language that's being used now doesn't feel dramatically different than language 15 years ago. And so I do have a little bit of a feel of skepticism when I hear the language to think how much has really changed. But I do think that there is a conversation around what is the role of corporations, around stakeholders that is forward-looking. It's just a kind of a small part of the mainstream corporate pie. But while those most progressive leaders are having that conversation, I feel like there is a momentum. The momentum in impact investing seems to be, look at us, we're real capitalists. And I feel like that's a funny thing because I worry that we may arrive there only to discover that we came to the wrong party. Or if anything, I would like us to be kind of both leading towards that future place together. But we are focused on, I think appropriately focused on saying there's parts of what we're doing that are like the regular parts of the market, and it would be more beneficial if more capital came into those parts of the market, which is all true. But it is interesting that there's a willingness on the part of some of the most progressive corporate leaders to frame a different conversation about how this is all supposed to work. And I do feel like in the impact investing space, oddly, we don't really seem to have that language and that narrative, or we don't really collectively have that confidence. And so I just sort of wonder if there's more we could do to be thinking about that third place we're all trying to go. So.
Hi everyone. My name is Megan McCurria. I bring the social entrepreneur side of things. I'm unusual. I actually live in Nairobi. Some people don't get that. I've lived there for 14 years. I moved after 2 years after graduating from Harvard to try to figure out how to unlock the most opportunity for the most girls. And I think one of the provocative things that I've just seen is there are gatekeepers. And so for me, there's a lot of social entrepreneurs who come from CGI, come from Bain, come from the World Bank, come from the World Economic Forum, and they already get the system for funding. And so I'm still trying, this is my first time at SoCap and it's a delight, and I'm trying to still figure out that map of who are the gatekeepers and how do you navigate those partnerships. So that's been really interesting for me to think about. I first went to Kenya working with street children, helping them get from full-time streets to full-time education through university. Realized sanitary pads were our second biggest cost, and decided to figure out how to solve that problem, ideally globally, through partnerships. And I think from a social entrepreneur's point of view, really what questions you start asking really frame the business model. And I think a lot of social enterprises, particularly now in the menstrual health space, which is what I'm in, are doing very small scale, women in a room making products, which answers a certain question. But if you're really thinking about scale, that's why I chose a contract manufacturing model. One of the partnerships we've innovated, I think it's really important to have partnerships on the ground. So we turned the major producer of pads in Kenya from our competitor to our collaborator. So we're not only contract manufacturing with their off time, but we're also working together on a website to hold the government accountable to distribute the sanitary pads that they've committed to. They've committed to about $3.5 million each a year over the last 5 years, and that's partly due to our lobbying. So that's a really interesting way for local partnerships. I think I'm really excited about working in kind of thinking laterally with other partners on the ground about if we're all working with the same clients, right? There are only so many girls and women in Kenya, only so many girls and women in the world. How do we actually leverage our best strengths to serve those together? So an example of that is we have a comic book where we use comics to deliver rights-based health education. And we partnered with a comics team that's funded by Gates and others to create our initial comics. And our characters might go in each other's comic books because all the kids are reading the same book. So why not have that cross-pollination to make it more fun for them? So those are some of the partnerships that I'm really excited about. We have had the privilege of having some amazing funding partners. We went for 4 years without getting any money because this is such a novel topic. So I knocked on all the doors, and again, those gatekeepers, they're like, who are you? What are you doing? Sorry, you're not in our silo. But then Gates Foundation really took a risk and came and joined us, and then came for phase 2 and pulled Grand Challenges Canada into this. And they've been such thoughtful learning partners, so they've really taken the time every quarter to have like a 2-hour meeting and really understand what we're doing, how our theory of change is evolving, and how our business model is evolving. And they've been really able to provide some strategic guidance, I think, and that kind of trust and collaboration has been really exciting. So I think for successful scale, you need those local ecosystems to be activated, and you need those funding ecosystems through the gatekeepers. And it is a little bit of a game, so you get it. We got into the Growth Hub then, which is a wonderful incubator in Nairobi, became an Ashoka Fellow, now we're in SoCap. So there is this little kind of map, almost like Chutes and Ladders, I think, to get to. And there's some examples that I can give maybe later of one of our partners that's doing some really interesting innovation as well. But I think I'll pause there.
Great. I have a whole bunch of questions for you guys from that. But I just want you guys, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning, the diversity we have. We have, if you will, a smaller startup, although not so much of a startup anymore, a large multinational, and then a very well-known and respected funder. And I think it gives us an interesting balance, because we will all view, I guess a little more of an academic, we all view the world a little differently, and rather than ignoring the differences, we want to treasure them a little bit. So I'm going to kind of pick on some of the themes you guys mentioned and then talk about it. And Giselle, I love this idea of, we're trying to accelerate relationships, right? And we turn them into transactions. That got me thinking of, one of the most popular things now for enterprises is to get into an accelerator, right? And, maybe they need to get into a decelerator. But, the point being that there's something misaligned with our metrics. We're operating in a space, we call it base of the pyramid, you can call it inclusive business, that among other things is a context that's particularly challenging to work, and I would argue requires relationships and time and energy to be successful. Yet, we can't seem to line up against metrics that will allow us to be successful. And when we go to partners, if we're a company, we're not always honest about the true metrics because we don't think the partners will tolerate those. And funders in particular. They want to return in X amount of time, and you're talking about something that takes Y. So a question for us, and there isn't an answer. I look at Giselle not because you can answer this question, but it seems to be a consistent theme of how do we set ourselves up for success from either the enterprise side or the partner side, where we can build the kinds of relationships that will allow us to be successful. What have you seen that's really worked and stood the test of time? I know, Sasha, you mentioned that maybe this thing with Dow. Why does some of these seem to work and last, and why does some others sort of fitter away? What have you learned from thinking about kind of aligning metrics in the space? And it's open to any one of you guys, or you can come back and ask me too. I don't just have to be the interrogator. I'm happy to offer thoughts, but this seems to be a continuing challenge.
I can start. On the metrics side, in some ways, I know Sasha will say it better because I heard him say some of it last week. So I'll defer some of that to him, but I would say on the metrics point, picking up what I said earlier, it's an agreement of not even just what to measure, but how to measure it. And I would say even within an industry, so with me having a strong international development background and then moving to more of a business background and getting investors, even before you have the partnerships, just within your space. Maybe you could comment, for example, within different social enterprises working in that space across the world, not measuring the same things, and there's a lot of debate about it, and a lot of colleagues of mine who work in that space have talked about feeling this pressure to come up with something different, to show that you are being innovative and almost reinventing the wheel to create your space there. So I think part of getting away from that is also about trust and building relationships. And part of the theme about this panel is, how can you bridge boundaries between whether it's an MNC or an impact investor? And one way is just sharing these metrics. Here are the top 5, top 7 things that just collect this data so we can see what models work, not what examples work. But even that does require trust. And this understanding that, yes, we do have the same goals. And that becomes a very profound question because we don't necessarily have the same goals. Then it comes down to when we're having an inclusive business or an impact investment, what is okay for inclusive from whatever standpoint I'm coming from versus what you're coming from. So I suppose I'm throwing more things out there than I'm answering. But this is why I think segmenting the market is becoming such a thrown around phrase right now, because some people want to invest impactfully as long as it gets market returns. Others are very proudly saying we're not going to get market returns because we're achieving an impact that can't, but it's still valuable. So in terms of collaboration around metrics, no one in the space has done a great job of showing the financial value of social impact, and not just now, but also on financial projections. And I think that's a huge area for collaboration that I can throw back to you, because it can also be a space where academia could play a role.
I'm going to throw it back to someone else in a second, but I think that's right. And one of the things and I don't want to get this into a conversation about metrics and impacts, because there's more to partnerships than that. And I think we have to be careful to think about it. And part of it is the length, that people are in it, we want to scale, we want to do this, we want to do this in a very difficult market, and you got to demonstrate X in 3 years.
But the wrong metrics can really throw off a potentially wonderful partnership.
So talk about what do you mean by the wrong, when we say metrics, we best be clear what we mean by metrics.
Well, for example, in our industry, I've had a lot of potential funders say, how many jobs are you creating?
So these are impact metrics.
These are impact metrics for impact investors. They want to create jobs. And we're trying to do the leanest manufacturing possible because we know our customer and we know that women want a high quality, low cost product. So I only need 3 people on my production line to spit off 200 pads a minute. I don't need 500 women across the country manufacturing pads all day. And there's nothing wrong with that ladder. But there's a sense of value that certain impact investors place on the latter versus the former. And we actually didn't get into a certain unnamed accelerator because I said I will not prioritize having girls sell products as a key indicator of success, because I want those girls to be in school and I want those products to be on the retail shelves where I know the poor are going, because 50% of shoppers in supermarkets are women below $4 a day because they want to buy in an aspirational place, but they're only consuming 1/3 of all sales, and those aren't washing machines that they're buying the small fast-moving consumer goods. And so there was a huge disconnect for several key places that we could have had tremendous alliances because we share the same goals, but I'm not creating 5,000 jobs, I'm creating 25. And I think that that's a real limitation, and when you can co-create those metrics, that can be wonderful. And a great example of that is Grand Challenges Canada. Their CEO actually came and we had a roundtable discussion in Nairobi with all of their grantees. And they said, here's what we're thinking about measuring. It's going to get finalized in like another 2 months. Can you tell us what is missing? And because he came and visited one of our schools, and we have girls write down their questions on anonymous pieces of paper, and he was blown away by the number of questions about rape and incest. And he said, we don't have any metrics to measure reduction in gender-based violence among adolescent girls. This is a problem. And so he's putting that in there. So that's a key example of being inclusive in that process. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so part of my role, I think, is to be a little provocative. So I'll just be provocative, not to you, but there's a question then of, because you sort of said, they want metric as jobs, and I don't disagree with the flaw in that. The question: are you looking for the wrong partners, or are the right partners just not there? So is this sort of a systemic problem? Or is it a subset? Because one of the arguments that I put out is that sometimes it's better not to partner than to partner with the wrong person. And sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to get a partnership that's sort of flawed from the beginning, and the chances of being successful are very low. And maybe I'll turn it over to Sasha and sort of say, what do you think? When you look at enterprises, are there some that are just really cool, but just aren't good partners for Acumen because of maybe what you want to achieve? I don't know whether I know Acumen fairly well, I'm Jocelyn for a long time, but you guys aren't necessarily measuring jobs, but you have specific things you hope to achieve.
Sure. I mean, we probably turned down 19 out of 20 things. So maybe I'll pick up on the other, so I'm more than happy to talk about impact metrics, and I'm more than happy to talk about how we pick investments. But on the kind of us partnering with corporates, I guess I'd start with saying we actually we're in the middle of the first partnership in which we have a corporation that has kind of, in Unilever, that has long-term, very public goals, and that they're partnering with us in service of those goals. So we don't yet have the data back to say how that's going to go. I do think that but I totally agree. To get into any long-term anything, and even on our investments, I guess the only thing I'll say there is, even for our team, says, look, we're going to deploy this you've got like a 30-year-old investment manager who's trying to be successful and has found something, is excited, is doing her first transaction. It is very hard for that person to really conceptualize that acumen might be in this deal until they're 37 or 39 or 40, right? So there is a long-term nature of these relationships that I think at an executional level is kind of hard to institutionalize, which I don't know what the answer is. And on the metric side of what everybody's looking for, yeah, I think you have to be really, really clear. And in your case, I mean, I think that's sort of the best example. Is this really well-intentioned thing around, oh, well, isn't it great to create jobs? Sure, it's great to create jobs, but I'm actually trying to solve this different problem. And I guess I would say overall, it's the onus of, for more people to do what you're doing, which is to say, here's my theory of change, here's what I'm trying to accomplish, and hopefully here's the data that I can share with you that will make you understand it. And honestly, if that's kind of not the social change that you're in the market of buying, although I shouldn't feel that transactional, then, I'm not going to be able to deliver it. And I think that people do an okay job of that, and frankly, let's be clear, all of these relationships are, is there enough overlap between our two circles to make this work? And that's what good partnership is like. And it's a skill, it's confidence, it's knowing that you will be able to eat tomorrow if you say no. I mean, we shouldn't simplify it too much. Yeah.
But I do think I'm seeing a lot of humility in some of the donor and partner areas that we're in. Like last year, Investor Circle had a global health learning lab, and so they brought 4 of us social entrepreneurs from 4 different parts of the world together, and we're just asking questions like, is this working? What could we do better? What are no social entrepreneurs saying to us because they're afraid of us because they want our money that we need to hear? And I think that's so important, and that goes back to the trust. And even this morning with Investor Circle and Duke's Seed and Innovations in Health program, we had USAID there, we had individual investors in there, and USAID was saying, well, how can we provide risk mitigation funding? How can we provide the base of social impact support that's necessary? Because, as a social entrepreneur, I can't take like a $300,000 loan to prove that my social impact is worthy. That needs to come from grants. So I think that there are more donors now than I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years talking to each other about how they can use their best expertise to come together to solve the problem and work with the entrepreneur. And I think that's a really hopeful thing.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw out a couple things for us to think about. One of them that when we talk with our partners and trying to understand building a partnership is to really understand the metrics that drive your partners. What are they really after? And I think people sometimes are naive, because they have to report to someone else no matter what they say. And if you don't really understand what your partner's after, it's going to be very difficult. And so that's more of a statement. And now, a thought for you guys. You may disagree on that statement. And the second thing is, we have talked a lot about funders and funding as a partner. But I would argue that that is just one piece of a very small puzzle. And enterprises, to my knowledge, have over-focused on trying to get funding partners. Not that they shouldn't, but it's not the end-all and be-all. You need funding, and you need a bunch more partners for distribution, for market creation, for building your capacities of your team, for market intelligence, for connections into the local area, for regulatory change. And I think, can you talk a little bit about, and we throw out this term, and I won't define it because I will let you define it, but this idea of building a partnership ecosystem, where you begin to think more robustly about the partners that you think you need to go to scale. Have you had examples of where you've either sort of brought on more partners that have really helped, you've brought on partners that have hurt, or you've looked and said, we're really missing something, how do we fill it? And you've done it sort of from a multinational, you've done it on the ground in Kenya, and maybe, Sasha, you've seen a number of enterprises across that you've been one of several partners engaged. So think about it as an ecosystem. Where have you seen success, and what are some of the big challenges in thinking about it that way?
Well, I can talk about some work that Land O'Lakes is doing in Ethiopia and Tanzania. I like that example because you have economic structures and governmental structures in those two countries that are very different. So in both places, multinational companies are coming in for the first time in this livestock genetics sector, in both places targeting smallholder farmers to provide services that are currently unavailable at a good price point. But whereas in Tanzania, more privatization has happened and there's a lot of openness, and it's kind of a, you certainly have meetings and co-creation about how you want to do something, but it's much easier from the governmental side to enter the market as a private multinational. In Ethiopia, the situation is very different from a regulatory standpoint. And there was a lot of talk early on about just leave Ethiopia aside, because from a governmental standpoint, it is just too complex to operate there. From a business standpoint, it won't work, and it's going to drive the MNCs away. And certainly it took a lot more effort and ingenuity to have that partnership, but I think the first thing I would say was that it was treating the government as a partner rather than a stakeholder that needed to be consulted or informed or talked to or talked at, change this policy, etc. The way we're working with government of Ethiopia down to the municipal level is as a co-creator. They are with us every step of the way. So, even though on day one, what they were saying is, by the way, absolutely no multinational companies, we don't do that in Ethiopia. Then like months ago, the state minister was writing us an email saying, completely opening the door to you. You guys are fantastic. But it was because of the time that we took, and not just us, but the multinational companies and the in-person visits, and doing it not just on our terms or the company's terms, but on their terms, because we all have the same overall goal, smallholders benefit, but the pathways there, like you can put metrics aside, it's even just the pathways are different. What's going to take advantage of people and what won't, and just needed to get to that same page. So that's one example. And then the other thing I won't get into it, maybe there'll be a question about it later, but just to tee it up a bit, is even when all partners want to invest in the same thing, how do you make sure the integrity of the intentions of that investment are maintained over time? So in our case, you have these multinational companies investing, they say they want to help smallholders, everyone wants to help smallholders as part of this. But if you have like a franchise model, how do you make sure that all those franchisees stick to those intentions when they could also just sell to commercial farmers, have a smaller number of customers, and make the same amount of sales? So had some innovation there as well.
So there are a couple, I think when you think of a partnership ecosystem to go to scale, you can either think about it as, how do I as a social entrepreneur take my business to scale, or how do we actually scale the industry? And I think the second question is much more interesting. I'm not in it myself to just see my organization succeed. I want to actually change the system for 1 billion women who are out of it. So a great example is actually yesterday, I got the first chance to meet the innovators from Akar Industries, which are in India. And so we sat down this morning and talked about, okay, they've got a biodegradable plastic or compostable plastic outer layer, but it's too thin, so you can't use it on commercial machines. So what would it look like to do a grant together to actually do the R&D, because I have material scientists on my team, to make the plastic compatible to, the non-plastic, compatible to run on commercial machines. So if we could do that, we've also got an innovation on the inner layer, so then that could completely change the system. So I think thinking laterally and redefining competition and collaboration is a really interesting opportunity in social enterprise. Another really great example is one of our partners, the Paper Seed Foundation, that are part of the Cellmark Group, which is a forestry-based company in Scandinavia. And they, as a company, are getting all of their suppliers around the world to buy into their CSR program. So for example, we've gotten a couple of sea containers donated of sanitary pads that have allowed us to work with 26 community-based organizations to teach them about child protection policies, rights-based health education, data collection, so we can get metrics from 10,000 girls without having to have all of our own staff, and like really building from the grassroots up. And Paper Seeds allowed us to do that. And now they're thinking about talking to some other suppliers who make paper to print our comics, because that's a huge cost driver. So then Paper Seed wins because they're engaging their suppliers who don't do any CSR to now do CSR. And we get to impact, hopefully then, hundreds of thousands of kids next year because our cost of printing is now zero. So those are two different types of partnerships that I think really can build the ecosystem to go to scale and are really redefining how they see their own business.
So I mean, and this is, for me, these are the kind of interesting conversations, because I think it is right to think of government not as somebody that you have to manage, but potentially a partner that can actually help, and rethinking about competitors in different ways. And sometimes, you know, if you think about the investment last, maybe it's a little easier to go to investor when you've got the other pieces of the puzzle instead of trying to think about it first. And I think that, you know, as we move forward, it's both the challenge of bridging impact investing and inclusive business. There's that whole issue of how do we make sure we're communicating, we can actually work, we have the right metrics, that we really have a vision of the future that's aligned. But then it's thinking about how do we, you know, if you crowdsource, whatever term you want to use, how do we get the whole set of partners we really need in this space? And, you know, one of the challenges that I see out there a lot is there seems to be an aversion to the word subsidy. And that somehow subsidy in business, at least in the space we're in, doesn't work. And for me, that's slightly insane. Because, you know, in the US, we subsidize all kinds of businesses, and we subsidize market creation.
Just the big ones.
Well, however, you know, no, I mean, Obama, you know, made a big plea to solar, you know, and renewable energy. But when we're interested in doing something and we want businesses to get involved, but they won't, we're willing to subsidize different things. So that it's not a bad thing. The question isn't should we subsidize business, but how should we do it well? And I think we sort of have these knee-jerk reactions. And I think we need more conversations like this where we're pushing on some of the big challenges that we have rather than just sort of honing in on a couple and sort of broadening out the question set. And with that, what I'd like to do is we have about 15 minutes left. We'd love to see what you guys think. Do you guys have some questions for the panelists that you'd like to raise? There was supposed to be someone here with a mic. If you talk really loud, I bet you we can hear you. Let's see what happens.
So this is a question for the investors.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, my name's Chad Litton. I work at National Geographic. And I believe Sasha mentioned that you're talking about how out of every 20 investments, there was 19 of them that disqualified. The question that I wanted to ask was, after you've looked at a company and it's passed like that first glance and you're interested, what's like the most common thing that kind of disqualifies those companies that you would say, okay, they haven't passed that second bar? Or is there a common thing?
Don't answer that, because we're going to try and collect 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll go back to these guys. So. Yeah. But don't answer that question yet, would be the question, sorry. But I would like to get a few questions, just so we have a set.
I guess this is just following up on Giselle, your experience, which is really interesting, but you obviously have a foundation paying for the relationship building process. What other models are there to fund that relationship building in an ecosystem development? Because I think it's really important, and it's also very expensive.
Maybe
I'm sure I'm not supposed to answer that, so.
This maybe departs from where the panel went, but it goes back to the first comments that Giselle made. More kind of general on inclusive business. And I think I understand things more from the agriculture space because we work in agriculture too. And I've seen inclusive business with outgrower schemes where you're involving farmers as suppliers. They look great on paper sometimes, and they function really well sometimes in execution, but other times they're almost building semi-feudal structures. So I think what you talked about, you know, I know you guys are cooperative and you work on farmer-owned structures, but I've also seen big companies get involved with it. They're essentially they're using farmers as suppliers, but with an interest in keeping them dependent on their own company and also maximizing their profit. So paying them a little more, but maybe not as much as they could based on what they're getting for the sale of the products. So the question is, in the inclusive business space, how does one walk that line between inclusive but semi-feudal structures and inclusive but empowering structures, right? And from a funding perspective, how do you, are funders paying attention to that nuance when you're talking about inclusive business? And I also thought about the employment, right? Is there a consideration of if you're creating jobs, are you creating good jobs, but the quality of jobs, right? That's
So I should have put a caveat, you only get one question, you raise your hand. So what I want to do is, you guys are welcome to answer any or any piece of any of these questions, but try and pick out some of the things that you think will be really interesting. We don't want to get into debate about things, but what are the big insights that you've sort of, as you
Can I just clarify, your question was so specific of like, they've gotten over the first hurdle, but then they fall out after, and can you just specify why at that moment? I'm trying to think of the answer also, but so I'm not just buying time.
I guess the thought, like I hear pitches all the time, and so a lot of times in that first 30 seconds, I'm like, this actually sounds really good and promising. That's kind of what I'm talking about. They get you within the first 30 seconds, and you want to learn more, and then you may set up a call or whatever. And it's just when you dig deeper, are there common things that you see that, hey, they're just completely exaggerating with their projections, or is there something similar to that? And if there's no like very common thread, then maybe
No, I mean I'll try, but then there's a related point from the thing. Right? Anyway, I don't think there's some vast insight. I think the numbers don't play out. The projection really looks optimistic. You go discover that the product quality isn't what you thought it was. I mean, I think at that early stage, it's kind of the stuff that you expect. It's a later stage where deals fall apart because that second investor didn't come through, because you discover this one thing that was really key is actually not. So I think they're more kind of chunky things that make something fall apart. But I think at that early phase, I can identify themes that I think are really. But it's sort of related to this, but Ted, I was just thinking when we were talking about, ask for the money last. I've done a lot of fundraising, and that is actually good advice. But I guess what I would say is there is, I think the bigger, better funded player in every relationship can do a really good job about being really sensitive to timescales, right? And so if you're worrying about keeping the lights on and they just have an annual whatever, it's just not. So I think that, and in general, we have failed at this many times as well as a potential investor into a company. And so I think in general, really being clear about what your timescales are and kind of owning that. And if you have an institution behind you that can only move at a certain speed, you raise trust, I think, by starting out and saying, here's what I'm going to do well, here's what I'm going to do poorly, and I'm going to lay that all out now. And if you can't kind of weather that storm or whatever, don't. And I think where things really get messed up is when people don't own that. And I guess my related, which is just sort of on how all of these relationships work and when I've seen them work well and poorly, is, and this is, I've even felt this when I worked in these big companies, for the little guy, the first thing you need to figure out, I would say, is the person who's representing the big guy, like where do they sit in that? Because it's very easy to get fooled into someone who's like, oh my God, she gets it. And it turns out like she gets it, but she has no ability to make anything happen or whatever. And frankly, we've had a lot of experience, a lot of people we've dealt with a lot of corporations, and everything's going great, and they like all leave their jobs and they all leave their companies. Because the reason we're connecting is because they don't really like being part of that system. And so they're not influential in that system. And I just want to say that out loud because it's real. And my disillusionment as being a professional working in CSR was I thought, I'm going to have the power of the company behind me. And it's like I spent all my time trying to make the company do stuff until I finally said, there are better ways for me to make a change in the world. So I think there's something about kind of owning that as a representative of whatever it is you are, but also if you are new to this, to be really savvy. And I think in getting a lot of information, not a lot of people, if you say, hey, do you have any authority at all? Like, you can't get an answer to that question. But I really think you need to have your antenna up because I sort of think the person you want is the one who sort of seems a little bit like a naysayer. Because it's more likely that they're going to be like, look, this is all great, but if I can't get my supply chain costs down by 3% this year, nothing's going to happen. Arms crossed. Prove it to me. Because if you can convince her of that, then she might be the person who can really make things happen. So I think there's just this like sophistication and awareness that just because someone passes you a business card with a fancy Fortune 50 company on it, you have learned very little about what they represent. And I think you can waste a ton of time if you don't kind of bottom that out. So.
Yeah, I'll just add to some of what Sasha said, and in doing so, try to answer your question, which is, in our experience working with multinational companies, I mean, so in one recent deal, we did due diligence on 13 companies, which was interesting because you're pitching this investment and trying to get companies to enter markets that they haven't entered so far, but at the same time trying to see, do our objectives for this investment align at the same time? And to Sasha's point, a lot of times when you have those meetings, you're meeting with the director of emerging markets and international business, the people who really want this kind of thing to happen at their company. This is why they're working at the company. And with every relationship that went forward to an actual deal, we brought the CEO in really quickly. And we knew it, and the person on the other side knew it too. You know, we would just get to a point in our relationship where we said, if this is gonna happen, you know, eventually someone has to get your board of directors and your shareholders to agree that, yes, you can pour millions into this greenfield market and take what could be seen as a big risk. So I would really support Sasha's point in that, because you can otherwise go down a path for a long time and then realize you're not talking to someone who can pull the strings. So agreed on that. To answer your question about how do you have the resources to do long-term relationship building, there are a couple of things. Because yes, it is expensive and because it takes a lot of time. In the case of Land O'Lakes, because our International Development Division has been working for the last 35 years, in many cases that's been an asset for us. You know, when we're trying to bring multinational companies into a place where we've worked for 15 years, a lot of those governmental relationships with farmer groups, etc., they're long established. It could potentially be a negative if you didn't maintain those relationships well, but that is something that's helped. But then I'd also take something Sasha said and sort of give it a different spin. He was saying that the better funded partner could also be very sensitive to timescales. So in my experience, it can work that the better funded partner could be a funder who really has certain metrics that they need to meet by the end of the year, and they're like, go, go, go. The better funded partner can also be the multinational company who is saying, I'll fund, you know, like I've seen examples like the Shell Foundation funded relationship building with an international development organization for a year.
Michelle's not, yes, but they're, first of all, totally exceptional, and B, they're not Shell.
True and true, but I would say it's still an example of some entity decided.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yes.
That's the behavior that's needed.
Yes, so that is this kind of like leading behavior that we're not seeing otherwise. And I brought up that example because I can't think of another example that I know of where so the word exceptional is correct. But you can also look at, in our case and deals we've done, these multinational companies who, some of them, you know, in our scenario, we're saying everything is very good here, but we would have had more multinational partners if we didn't have to work at a pace that a certain donor wanted us to go at. And those companies were willing to fund some of the relationship building because they wanted the time. So I think, you know, for people in some industries, like working with these donors, part of it is to get a really clear message across that building those relationships, if you want to get that sustainable private investment that aligns with impact and inclusivity, you have to actually fund some time. Like we've had a case where with the Gates Foundation, they funded, not a lot, it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to be used carefully to build relationships with 13 companies that would have been very challenging to do otherwise. Yeah.
We're punting on feudalism.
Pardon?
I said we're punting on feudalism.
Well, I do think a lot of structures can be very neocolonial though, and not additive but extractive. And I think that is a problem that sectors and individuals need to look at is, are we adding value or are we extracting? You know, for instance, I think one of the sectors that's not on this kind of the list of the things that we're talking about on this panel is kind of macroeconomic development and like global trade policies and things like that. You know, for example, in sanitary pads in Kenya, because of the way that large donations, you know, from governments have been structured and policy deals, it is cheaper to import finished products you have no tax on that, but to actually make your own product in Kenya, you have to pay taxes on all the raw materials. So if you're trying to create macroeconomic development in Kenya, you're actually already at a 16% operating loss. So I can't change that system. International governments need to change that system. In America ourselves, we didn't get better ourselves until we had incredibly protectionist policies, right? To build our own business and large scale infrastructure. And we're not helping other countries do that. And until that piece of the puzzle starts getting on these conversation tables, I don't think we're really going to see a gigantic change in emerging economies. I mean, Kenya's GDP, it's growing at 6%. That's awesome, but it's also even more unequal than America. They don't have the 1%, they have the 0.25%, right? So they're getting richer, but on the backs of the poor in some ways too, and we need to change that macroeconomic system if we're going to have our impact investment dollars work better and smarter, I think.
I mean, so I don't know if we got to answer all your questions. The good news is these guys will hang out afterwards, answer a few more. Anish, do you want to try the feudal system?
We can chat more afterwards, but I can't speak from a funder perspective about what they're paying attention to and what they're not, but I think Megan's example from earlier about job creation applies not just to donors, but also in the impact investing sphere. It's a metric that a lot has been latched onto, so there is something there. But I'll go back to the example I used from the Philippines earlier, just to say from a very personal standpoint, the reason I got into this space was because I saw that it was a model there that was working, but it wasn't, to use your word, feudal at all, and that's what kind of revitalized me to stay in this industry, to be honest. It was completely farmer-led, et cetera, all the nice things you want to hear. But without going into details as to what that all looked like, I would say the reason why was because the person who, on the Western side of things, was leading the retail relationships, this was a woman who 20 years earlier had lived for years in these completely remote rice terraces as a Peace Corps volunteer, maintained those relationships over 2 decades, then did her master's with a Filipino woman in the US. And so she had that counterpart where, again, over 2 years when they were doing their studies, formed a very common understanding of what they wanted to achieve, regularly keeping farmers engaged through visits back and phone calls and things. And so I know I keep coming back to this issue of trust and relationships, but when I was there living with these farmer groups for 6 months, interviewing them all in depth, what I kept hearing was, this person really understands us and we trust her. And they would even say, even though our culture is very distrustful, we know she understands us. So sometimes even when we question things, we can still come back to that. And so I don't know how much the industry writ large is looking at those kinds of issues when they are looking at certain metrics, but it's something to push for from the advocacy side of things.
I mean, for me it's surprising, but our hour is pretty much done. But what I'd like to do first is I think there are a couple of things that just jump out at me. And I'm going to give you guys a second because I'm going to ask you each to summarize with something really brilliant and insightful that everyone can take away and say. There were 3 great points. But I think one of the things that I'm struck by, and I think this goes a little bit back to Megan's point, is we need to make sure we're asking the right questions. And maybe it's not how do we get the best deal, but how do we actually create an ecosystem or a set of enterprises that can truly flourish. And it was sort of going back to what you were saying too about we need to expand the conversation if we're going to do this to get more people engaged. So if you think about partnerships as a field, a domain, or whatever, there may be others that we want to engage as well. And what I like about a panel like this is there's some really interesting insights that you guys have shared, which is great. But you've also raised some really interesting questions, and you're not expected to be able to answer them all. How do you engage government as a partner is a really interesting question, right? But it's something we need to think about more, right? And part of these panels is to walk away with ideas about what we want to do next, not necessarily just to solve them. And one thing I don't like very much is panels where everyone tells you how great they're doing. And you walk away going, really? It's that easy? And these are much more interesting, so I appreciate that. I'm putting you on the spot. What is it that folks can walk away with that they should really, either it's something you've learned that you think is crucial, some ideas that you think, require more thought, or just sort of one big takeaway of your experience in this field that you want to share.
I can go. So I think I founded Zona Africa on the deep belief that when we all come together from diverse backgrounds as equals to the table, we can be finding solutions that none of us could have come up with on our own. And I would say that I don't even think we still have the right people in the room. For example, I don't think there's a single African investor at this conference of like 3,000 people. I think that the only Africans that I've seen are some of the entrepreneurs. That's a problem when we're trying to solve problems in Africa. And we need to have the right people at the conversation table to be asking the better questions to find more substantial answers. So that's my last parting shot.
That's a good one. I think as an investor, we try to be good at saying no quickly so we can invest time in the things that we really need to invest time in. And I think from a partnership perspective, we're trying to learn how to do that as well on both sides, meaning there are lots of potential partners out there in the world. There are lots of people they could partner with as well. And if we can kind of figure out that there is enough overlap of kind of attitudes and orientation and really most importantly purpose, then it's worth making the investment. And I don't quite know how we get better at that deciphering, but I do think it's kind of hard enough to make these things work as it is because we're different sizes and we have different reasons for showing up. And so we're not just trying to figure out a way to partner, we're trying to actually figure out a way that Acumen can help large multinational corporations partner proactively with social enterprises. I think it's a unique value that we're trying to bring to the table. Like most multinationals shouldn't try to do that and don't want to try to do that, and it's going to not work. So we're just trying to get a lot better. And so there's some things we're doing. So we'll do things like, and it's almost like a paying for time thing where we'll have a collaboration summit outside Nairobi and invite 20 or 15 or whatever large multinationals to come. And it's kind of a dip your toe in the water thing where we're not asking them for giant amounts of money and we're not asking our social entrepreneurs to talk to one of them, 20 of them to talk to one of them, but you kind of get 20 plus 20 into a room, and at the end of all of that, you kind of learn things about each other, and it's sort of served as a mutual filtering mechanism in a way where you can go, oh, okay, now we have a narrow list on both sides, either because the social entrepreneur knows how to take advantage, or you figure out that the corporate says, oh yeah, this is really for me. That's probably not the only way, but if there are ways to do it that are not just based on an individual person's sort of acuity and relationship building capacity, I think that's interesting. Because frankly, it's hard enough to make it work as it is. And I think if we can get better at figuring out on both sides where to invest the time, there'll probably be more yield.
So I've already made apparently a very good closing point for this, but I'll try to make something worth hearing again. I would say that post-investment, which it's hard enough to get it all together and get a deal through, but post-investment, there's this huge gap and this huge opportunity to gather more evidence about what models are working, not just what stories or examples like the ones I've given today, but the models that are working. And I think that's a huge opportunity for collaboration. I mean, inclusive business, impact investing, it's that if we're driven by some common sense of purpose, then we're all interested in which models work best. It's not that one will work well everywhere, I understand that, but we do need to get a little bit closer to different systems in different scenarios, thinking of the examples Megan gave earlier. And I think the more we collect that evidence, the more it incentivizes other players, the kind of players that we need, to be at venues like this, but to be entering the space in general. And so when you talk about ecosystem, Ted, well, there's all sorts of investments that can be made to build that ecosystem. Which are the most pressing ones? And I do feel we don't exactly know, because we're looking at anecdotes rather than a robust evidence base. So I think there's huge opportunity for us there to work together.
So I think, I will just close, but one theme that I think is crucial that they've all said, and I'll just reiterate it, is we need to make sure we retain our humility. we've just gotten started. We have a long way to go. We need to absolutely make sure that we're actually learning as we go and that we're sharing those learnings. So I'm like, you were talking about this thing after, I want to know what happened, right? You know, and the experience you guys are having. So one of the things we have to, you know, I think we have to always think about building the enterprise or the institute of today, but also how do we build the community of tomorrow? I mean, that's something that we in academia try and do, and to some level, and some of you are kind enough to let us sort of follow along with you and learn, but we're pretty good at sort of aggregating learnings and trying to understand, because we have to, and I think Sasha and Giselle both talked about this, and we have to understand what works better. And we can't keep wandering in the woods, trying to figure this out individually. We need to actually be a little more rigorous about figuring out what happens, and part of it is, we need to, I'd love to have a session here where people talked about enterprises that failed. Because that's where we learn a lot. How do we make sure that we're learning from both our successes and our failures, and how do we, because we can't understand success unless there's variation in success, right? So how do we use success and failure to help us get bigger and better? And I really want to spend a moment thanking our three panelists, because they came, no PowerPoints, not sure what questions I was going to ask, where we were going to go, with the deal that they would be thoughtful and not be trying to promote their own endeavors, but really share their experiences. And I think they did a really great job. So thank you all for participating.